Oh, the mic is not here. Good morning, good morning. We begin today's daf. Today's daf is daf Nun Vav, 56, Meseches Bava Basra, Parak Cheskas Habatim. We begin today by thanking the Tilson and Wohl families of Eretz YIsrael for sponsoring all of the shiurim of the month of Av. So just a quick recap of where we were yesterday. So actually, it goes back to the Gemara that we started on Shabbos, which is that when a person is machzik b'nichsei hager, which essentially means that if there's a piece of property that does not have any owners, because the ger passes away, it doesn't have any yarshim, doesn't have any halachic family members, and therefore his estate is essentially left up for grabs. So now we talked about a person who comes by and wants to make a kinyan, wants to acquire the piece of property, and we spent time talking about what happens if there's a meitzar, or if there's some type of pathway in between. That was Shabbos' Gemara, and we went off onto a number of other discussions about different things that can divide a piece of property. So now the Gemara moves on to talking about this chatzav. So yesterday, it was brought up yesterday with, if you go all the way to the bottom of Nun Hey Amud Aleph, we had Amar Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hameitzer ba'achatzav mafsikim v'nichsei hager, and then it went on to distinguish between nichsei hager and peya and tumah. So that was yesterday's Gemara, and now we had Ravin Amar Rabbi Yochanan who said even with regard to peya and tumah there is going to be this machlokes, and now the Gemara goes on to Shabbos. So yesterday, I know the Rav already started it yesterday. I'll just quickly review it, just so like this we can pick up on today's Gemara easily. So then we had halfway through the Amud, we had Avol Shabbos low. When it comes to Shabbos, we're not going to be able to use this meitzar and this chatzav as a division. And then the Gemara went on and described what it was talking about. So we'll start 4 lines from the bottom. The Tanya, Rava says 5 lines from the bottom. Rav Amar fil in Shabbos. Even with regard to the halachas of Shabbos, this meitzar and this chatzav will be able to create this division in the property. Now the Gemara goes on to explain what this is talking about. The Tanya, for we learned in a brisa, hotzi chatzi grogeres. A person takes out half of this dried fig, thank you, and he takes it to a Rosh Hashanah. So let's just quickly review a few points with regard to hotzah we're going to have to know for today. So the basic idea of any hotzah is that a person transfers an item either from a Rosh Hashanah, a private domain, to a Rosh Hashanah, to a public domain, or the opposite, from a public domain, Rosh Hashanah, into a Rosh Hashanah, to a private domain. What does a person have to carry? A person has to carry something which is the size of this dried fig. Now, when it comes to a person violating Shabbos, there's different levels. There's a mazid. A person who violates Shabbos intentionally does not get the opportunity to be able to bring a karban chatas. A karban chatas is reserved as an opportunity for a kapara, for an atonement, for a person correcting the violation of Shabbos only if it's done unintentionally by mistake. Interestingly, when it comes to the halachas of Shabbos, we don't necessarily count how many times a person violated the Isser, because violating an Isser, violating one of the halachas of Shabbos, is not what gives a person an opportunity to bring a karban chatas. Rather, it's divided in how many shigagos the person made. How many mistakes, how many errors did the person make? A shogeg is defined by a person either forgetting that it's Shabbos today, which is probably the most common way that a person will violate Shabbos, by mistake. He wakes up in the morning, forgets that it's Shabbos. Or it's defined by a person making a mistake, thinking that a particular act is permissible. So Rashi writes this clearly in Paraklal Gadol, Masechah Shabbos. And actually, that's where the entire discussion with regard to all these mistakes is listed. And over there, Rashi tells us a shogeg, a mistake, is defined by a person forgetting that it's Shabbos or forgetting that this particular act is forbidden. Now, when we are determining how many chatos a person has to bring for multiple different forgettings, we're always going to count the ha'alamos. How many forgetful or slips did the person have in this lapse of memory about whatever it is that he's going to do? Not necessarily how many malachos, how many actions did the person do, but how many forgettings did the person have. Now, in our case, what we have to know is whether or not we can take two separate forgettings and put them together to be able to create a whole. Why? Because when a person transfers an item from a private domain to a public domain, the requirement has to be that he transfers something that meets that limit, that size, that fig size, right? That dried fig size from Rosh Yachid to Rosh Rabbim, or from Rosh Rabbim to Rosh Yachid. Now, if he carried only a half of this fig volume from Rosh Rabbim to Rosh Yachid, or from Rosh Yachid to Rosh Rabbim, then he would have to, in the same forgetfulness, carry the other half. That's one thing to get down. Then we also have to be able to understand the concept of different rishuyos. So we already mentioned there's Rosh Rabbim, public domain. We have Rosh Hayachid, which is a private domain. How do we define those? So a private domain generally is going to be described as any area which is private, a person's personal property. A fenced-in, a closed-in area is going to be Rosh Hayachid. What's a Rosh Rabbim? Rosh Rabbim is this very large public thoroughfare. So it's going to be 16 amos wide. It's going to have a tremendous amount of traffic going through it on a day-to-day basis. It goes from one city to the next. It takes a lot to be able to qualify something as a Rosh Rabbim. What happens if something's not a Rosh Hayachid? It's not a private domain. It's not my backyard. It's not either wide enough or large enough to meet the criteria of Rosh Rabbim. What is that? So that's generally going to be referred to as a Carmelis. What does the word Carmelis mean? So various different Rishonim try to explain what the word Carmelis means. The Rambam, in the beginning of the Pirush HaMishnayos and Maseches Shabbos, says that Carmelis comes from the word of Ke-Armelis. What is an Armelis? Armelis comes from the word Armela, which is the same thing as an Almana. What's an Almana? An Almana is a person who's not married, but not either single. In other words, as we say in Yiddish, Nishtahin or Nishtaher, right? The ideal state could either be being single or being married. A person who's not single or married is in a kind of category of its own. And that's the same kind of thing with regard to a property. It's not a Rosh Rabbim, doesn't meet the criteria of Rosh Rabbim. It's not either a Rosh Hayachid. It's not a private domain. This would be the typical street in any private neighborhood. It doesn't meet the criteria of Rosh Rabbim. It's just your street in front of your house. You can't either call that your private domain. It's not yours. You don't own it. So technically, midoraisa, there is no problem of carrying into that area. However, Chazal went ahead and made a takana that you're not allowed to carry there. That's why we're able to build an Eruv over there. Just to keep in mind, we've mentioned this a number of times. An Eruv is a rabbinic institution. Now, there is no such thing as a rabbinic institution that tells you you're allowed to violate any of these Surim Daraisa. In other words, if a person's hungry, we've gone through this before. A person's hungry, they're traveling on the road, taking advantage of the last few weeks of summer vacation, and they're driving someplace and they get hungry. And they say, you know what, there's no kosher restaurants over here. I'd like to stop at a local rest stop. I'll build an Eruv and I can go ahead and buy a cheeseburger. Obviously, that's not going to work. There's no such thing as building an Eruv to permit the person to be able to violate in this midaraisa. What does an Eruv do? What an Eruv does is, when Chazal made a takana to say that you're not allowed to carry into this area because it's too similar to a Rosh Rabbim, it's too similar to a public domain, Chazal also allowed us, under certain circumstances, to be able to go back to the real Dimidarais and say, yes, you're allowed to carry here. What are those circumstances? By building an Eruv, that's beyond the scope of today's share of what the concept of an Eruv is, how to build an Eruv. But ultimately, an Eruv is always going to be when there is a Dimi Drabanan. Chazal allowed us, under certain circumstances, to be able to skip that Ismi Drabanan. The fourth place we have to keep in mind is something which is called the Makom Patur. A Makom Patur is a place where the Chachamim did not institute any takana. What is a makom patur? Generally speaking, a makom patur is going to be some type of protrusion that comes out of the ground, which is not 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, and it's also shorter. So in other words, it will max out at a certain space, about 10 tefachim. So then, it's basically like a post. Like you have a post that comes out from the ground. So this is a makom patur. There's no problem at all to be in Rosh Hashanah and to carry from a makom patur to the Rosh Hashanah, or from the Rosh Hashanah into the makom patur, or the opposite. So again, if a person finds himself in Rosh Hashanah, he can pick something off the floor and put it on the top of a post. No problem whatsoever. No eruv necessary, and it's perfectly permissible. So those are the different rishuyos. So now with all that in mind, let's now get back to our Gemara. Sorry for the long detour. Tanya, for it says in the Brisa, Hotzi Chatzi Gro Geras, the person takes out half of this fig volume. Rosh Hashanah, V'hinicha, he puts it down. So he takes it out, he puts it down. V'chaz of Hotzi Chatzi Gro Geras, Acharas B'helam Echad. He takes out another half of this fig volume with one forgetting. Halach is chayiv. He's chayiv. Why? Because it was one forgetfulness. During that period of forgetfulness, he carried out the entire fig volume. Therefore, he's chayiv. Bishnei halamos. However, if it was 2 separate forgettings, then pater, he's going to be pater. Why? Because, again, the chiyuv chatas, the obligation for a person to bring a carbon chatas, is only going to be on forgetfulnesses. But each forgetfulness that this person had was not enough to require him to bring a carbon chatas, and therefore he can't bring a carbon chatas. He has something called the yediyah mechalekes. He has knowledge that divides it. Once you get knowledge of what happened, then he goes. You can't combine them together. Now, what happens in the next case? However, if behelam echad, if it was one forgetting, it is chayiv. B'shnei elam pater. We did that. Yomi disagrees and he says behelam echad. If it's talking about one forgetting, top of Nun Vav Amud Aleph, and it is birishus achas, he takes it into one domain, then chayiv, because you could divide the two together. That doesn't make any sense. You could combine the two together because it both goes to the same place. However, b'shtei rishuyos, if he takes out one half of a fig volume to one rishus, and then another half of a fig volume into another rishus, then pater. Why? Because you can't go ahead and combine those. For Amar Rabbi says, "V'hu sheyesh chiyuv chatos beinehem." The only way that you're going to be able to say that he's pater if he goes to 2 separate public properties is if there is a reshus hayachid in between those public properties. So it has to really be 2 really divided, separated public domains. How is it going to be separated? Because there's a private domain in the middle. Aval Carmelis. So this opinion says, if there's only a Carmelis, a typical public area, but not a real public domain, doesn't meet the public domain criteria, but it's still not private, in such a case, you're not going to be able to divide it. Abaya Amar, this is where this becomes relevant to our Gemara, Abaya Amar filu Carmelis, even a Carmelis is enough to divide the public area, to be able to say, if you take half of a fig volume to area 1, half of a fig volume to area 2, one makes it a separate area, having this Carmelis in the middle. Afilu Carmelis aval pisla, if it's this pesel, this little protrusion, this post that comes out, that's not enough to divide it, because it has to be something more significant than that. Rava Amar, this is our same Rava from before, afilu pisla, even if you only have this post that divides this Rishus Harabim, that is enough to say it's 2 separate domains, and therefore if you take half of a volume to domain 1, and half of a volume to the other side of this post to domain 2, then it's going to be a separate area, you can't combine it, and therefore the person won't be able to bring a karban chatas for the combination of those half fig volumes. As the Rava L'Taimei, Rava follows his reasoning of our Gemara, which is that this Meitzer and this Chatzav are able to be a dividing factor in this public domain. Dama Rava, Rosh Shabbos, Krishos Gittin, and because Rava says Rosh Shabbos is Krishos Gittin, Dama Rava, Rosh Shabbos, Krishos Gittin, Dami, he combines it, he compares it to the halachas of Gittin. What's this referring to? This halacha is that we learned in Maseches Gittin that when a person divorces his wife, he has to go ahead and nasan biyada. He has to put the get into her hand. Now, he doesn't actually have to put the divorce document into her hand. He can put it into her property as well. The problem is, in the case where she might not have any property of her own, what he would do then is he would be makna to her. He would give her a piece of his property, and then he would put the get. The Gemara uses the terminology of zarak get. He throws the get into her private property, and since it goes into her private property, the area that he gave her, she will thereby be divorced. Now, what happens if in this piece of property that he gave her, there's one of these posts? So, if you look at the Rashbam, over here he says, if he gave her part of his property, liskarish, in order to get divorced, v'zarak la get, he threw a get into that property, v'nafal ala pisla. What do you know? He tried to get it into a small piece of property, perfect aim. It landed right on top of the small little post. Shebachatzer, eina megureshes. Why? Pisla makom acharhu b'fnei atzmo. This domain, this little post that comes up, it's an entirely different area. The eino bechlal chatzer. It's not part of the courtyard that he gave her. The chatzer hiknala below pisla. He gave her a chatzar and not this post. The chad makom moshel inish, trei makomos lo moshel inish. So now that's what we say, and the Gemara goes on. The Ka'amar Rava Rosh Shabbos Dom Rosh Gittin. Rosh Shabbos is the same thing. Just like when it comes to Gittin, this post is a separate area. With regard to Maseches Shabbos, or halachas of Shabbos, this post is also considered a separate area, and it can divide. The Hachanamili in Shabbos have hachpas l'makom chashuv b'fnei atzmo u'machalik reshuyos. It goes ahead, has the ability to be able to divide this property. So again, Rava takes this approach. He compares the halachas of Shabbos to halachas of Gittin, just like when it comes to the halachas of Gittin. If a person throws the divorce document into her domain, into this domain that she recently acquired by him giving it to her, and it lands on top of the post, Rava says, no, I'm sorry, that's not part of the property, and it divides the property. Same thing is true with regard to Shabbos. If you take a half a grogeris into area 1, half a grogeris into area 2, and you have this division in between, you have this pesel, this post that goes up in the middle, the halacha is, it divides it, and therefore you can't combine those 2 fig volumes to create 2 half fig volumes, to create 1 fig volume, and therefore you're going to be patur from machatas. And that's going to be the same Rava that we mentioned earlier with regard to this chatzov and this meitzar. Okay, now the Gemara goes on. It says, Ein sham lo meitzar v'lo chatzov. Mai, what's the halacha? So again, we're talking about this way the Rashbam understands this Gemara is we're again going back to this nichsei ager, to this estate that went up for grabs after the passing of this ger. Now, what's the halacha? If there is no meitzar, so there's no border, there's no pathway, there's no chatzav. You don't have this chatzav plant, which was described again. It's this plant which goes straight down. It only takes nourishment from the area underneath it. So what's the halacha? How much do you get? The ger owns a tremendous amount of property. Do you get the whole thing just by digging a little bit? Rough like Porta, you go ahead, you dig a little bit in one area, are you going to get acres upon acres upon acres of land? How far does it go? The Gemara says, Pirish, Rabbi Marinis, Bishmo, he explained the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that the halacha is, he gets, Rashi says, Mishmo is Mishal Rabbi Yochanan. What does he get? Kol shenikras al shemo. Anything that's called this field of this ger. So you have this ger, let's just call him Reuven. And if you have something called Sedei Reuven, the field of Reuven, you go ahead, you start making chazaka in Sedei Reuven, you get the entire Sedei Reuven. However, the Rashbam points out, if it's referred to as Sados Shel Reuven, the fields in the plural of Reuven, then you're not going to get all those fields. Only the field that's referred to as the field in singular of Reuven, that's what you're going to get at that point in time. Gemara says, Heichi Dami, how does this work? Amar Papa to Karule Be Gargusa de Plani. An example of this is, this area is the Gargusa, which means the area that he irrigated from his well. So this field was irrigated by Reuven's well, and therefore gets the title. It's under the title of Reuven. That's what you're going to get, but it doesn't go on forever and ever and ever. Yosef Rav Acha bar Avia Mekemei Rav Asi. Rav Acha bar Avia said, he said before Rav Asi, Yosef v'ka'amar Meshmei Rav Asi bar Chanina. He said over in the name of Rav Asi bar Chanina, Chatzuva mafsik b'nichsei hager. A chatzuva could go ahead and divide in the nichsei hager. My chatzuva, what is this chatzuva? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Shabai Tichem Yeshua LiYisrael Es Haaretz. What's this chatzuva? So again, this is the same chatzav that we've been talking about. It's this plant that they would plant. Again, it takes nourishment only from what's underneath it, not from the sides. And what was the chatzuva? So the Gemara now goes on and says, the way that Yeshua himself marked off all the different properties. Yeshua took all of Klal Yisrael into Eretz YIsrael. He divided Eretz YIsrael and gave every shevet their particular area. So how did he divide the borders? He divided it by planting these chatzuvas. It's like this. He knew the roots will always go straight down. So even if the plant gets cut down, the roots will still be there to divide between the properties. And that's how he divided the properties. V'amr Yehuda Amarav Lo Mani Yoshua in Sefer Yeshua, because again, Yeshua wrote Sefer Yeshua, as the Gemara actually tells us in the beginning of this Masechta. Yeshua Kasav Sifra, he wrote a Sefer, so he doesn't count every single piece of property over there. The Gemara wants to know which ones did he count. Lo Mani Yeshua Ela Ayaros Omdos Ala Gvulin. He only counted the specific cities that stood by the borders, but he didn't have to count every single one of the cities. Only the ones that went on the border of that particular shevet. Amar Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Kol Shehar Eo Kadosh Baruch Hu LaMoshe Chayiv B'Maiser. Anything that Kadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe. So again, the pasuk tells us that Moshe went up to Har Nevo. When he went up to Har Nevo, Kadosh Baruch Hu showed him all of Eretz YIsrael. So now, but he didn't show him every area. Only what the Gemara says, Kol Shehar Eo Kadosh Baruch Hu LaMoshe. Any area that Moshe was shown, that's Chayiv and Maiser. Lafuke, my words that come to exclude. Gemara says Lafuke Kini v'Knizi v'Kadmoni. So again, what were the areas that were shown to Moshe? So that was the area of the Zayin Amim, which is the Chiti, the Girgashi, the Amori, the Knani, the Prizi, the Chivi, the Yevusi, all those areas that were immediately conquered by Eretz YIsrael. Those areas are areas where, if you're going to plant, you're going to be chayiv to take meiser. However, the areas that were subsequently conquered, or that will be subsequently conquered when Mashiach comes, we take over all those areas are not chayiv and meiser. What are those areas? Those areas are Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni. Now, what are those areas? Tanur Meir Omer, that is Naftucha, Arva, Vashamba. I don't know exactly what those are geographically nowadays, but that's the Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni. Yehuda Omer, Yehuda says, Har Seir, Ammon, Umoav, Shimon Omer, are Discus, Asya, and Aspamia. All those areas will eventually be conquered and become part of the Jewish dwelling of Eretz YIsrael. However, they're not going to be chayiv in Meiser. Now, Aspamia, it's important to point out, Aspamia is generally defined as Spain. I don't think it refers to Spain, because Spain is very far away from Eretz YIsrael. It's all the way to the west. It's not referring all the way to Spain. It's another area called Aspamia. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Hayu shnayim me'idim also sha'achla shal shanim. So again, just a reminder. How does a chazaka work? A chazaka works by a person moving into a field, staying there for the requisite 3 years, and if the original owner, the marikama, comes by and says, "Hey sir, my boss Bahayara, what are you doing in this land?" He responds, he comes up with a claim, and he says, "What do you mean? What's your problem? I bought this land. I own this land because I got it as a gift, or I inherited this land." But in this case, we're talking about a marikama. So there's our area. There's a person coming by and saying, "This land used to belong to me. what are you doing here? So he responds and he says, I bought this piece of property and I was here for the required 3 years. Now, how does he validate his chazakah? He brings 2 eidim who testify on his behalf that he was there for the required 3 years. Now, the problem just over here is that those eidim were found out to be eidim zomin. So let's just quickly go through what eidim zomin are. When 2 eidim come to Beis Din and they testify on behalf of somebody, they're believed. Because afishnayim eidim yakum davar. You can establish a set of facts based off of 2 eidim, based off of 2 witnesses. What happens if 2 other eidim come in and they testify the opposite? And they say, it's not true. This guy wasn't there. So then what you're left with is a trey. You have eidos, which is mukash, but you can't necessarily invalidate the first set of eidim, because 2 say yes, 2 say no. Why should we believe one set over the others? However, when it comes to eidim zomimin, we do indeed dismiss the first set of eidim. What are eidim zomimin? Eidim zomimin is when the second set of eidim don't directly contradict the testimony of the first group, but they testify that it can't possibly be true that the first group actually is telling the truth. Why? Because they say, we testify that the first group of eidim were in a different city at the time of their story. So, for example, 2 eidim come in and say, in years 2021, 2022, 2023, we saw that this guy was occupying the property, so we're testifying in his behalf, they made a chazakah. And another group comes in and says, I don't know how these eidim can possibly testify that Reuven was in this land for 3 years. We were actually next door neighbors with that first group of eidim. We lived in Yerushalayim, and none of us went to go visit that city. So imanu hayisa, you eidim, you're testifying that this guy was in the property. Your eidos can't possibly be true. Therefore, why? Because we were with you in a different location. You couldn't have seen him over there. Halacha is those eidim become, the original eidim become eidim zomimim. And the pasuk says, V'asisam lo kasher zomam lasos li'achim. Whatever they try to accomplish with their false testimony, they then have to pay back. So in this case, you have Marikama, the original owner, owned the field, and then you have this guy who's making a chazakah. He's trying to steal someone else's property, so he brings these false witnesses to validate his chazakah. Since those eidim tried to get the original owner to lose his field, they are then obligated to pay back to the owner the value of that field that they tried to get him to lose. That's what our Mishnah says. 2 witnesses come by, and they say that, let's just use names over here. Reuven took possession of this field and was here for 3 years. The Nimtzu Zomin, turns out that their eidos can't be true because they were in a different location. Meshalmin lo es hakol. They have to pay the original owner everything. What does hakol mean? So the simple understanding of hakol is because at the end of today's Mishnah, in the seif of the Mishnah, we're going to find out that sometimes it's going to be divided. However, the Rosh explains that hakol means that they have to pay not only the value of the field, but all the fruits that were eaten from the field. Because included in the testimony is that all the fruits that Reuven was eating while he was there, obviously less than the years of the chazakah, was the gneva. Reuven's now in the field. Okay? Now the original owner comes and says, Reuven, my bar's by Aryeh, what are you doing over here? He says, well, I'm here for the required years of chazakah. He says, no, you're not. You're here for 6 months. You just moved in. You don't belong in my field. I went away on business. I came back 6 months later in my field. You're claiming you're here for 3 years. Now the eidim come by and say, yeah, he was there for 3 years. Now those 6 months, he was in someone else's field eating the fruits off the trees. That's the gneva. So says the Rosh, not only do these eidim have to now reimburse the original owner for the field, they also have to reimburse him for those fruits that he ate big gneva. Now, what happens if you have an interesting case? Shnayim b'rishona. 2 eidim come by and testify that Reuven was there for year 1. Shnayim b'shniya. 2 eidim come by and say that Reuven was there for the 2nd year. Shnayim b'shlishis. 2 eidim, in other words, different groups come by and say he was there for the 3rd year. Now, and what happens? Turns out all 6 of these guys are liars. They're all turned out to be Eidim Zomin. What happens? Mishashlim b'neim. In such a case, they'll divide it, and they have to split the cost of the field into all those groups, and they pay it that way. What happens if Shlosha Achim? You have 3 brothers. The Echad mitztaref imahem. One person combines with each one of them. Harei elu shalosh eduyos vein edos achas la'azama. What does this mean? In year 1, so let's just say you have 3 brothers. We won't use Reuven because Reuven's already the one who's making the chazaka. So you have Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda are all brothers. Shimon and random guy testify that Reuven was there for year 1. Levi and random guy testify that he was there for year 2. Yehuda and random guy testify he was there for year 3. Now that edus is fine. Brothers can't testify together, but on each year, the brother is coming with another guy. So each one of those edus is fine because it's Shimon and a random stranger, Levi, random stranger, Yehuda, and random stranger. That edus is perfect. However, we could accept that edus. However, when it comes to hazama, you have to be mazim all of them together. In other words, as Rashbam says, Hareilu gimel eduyus lachi kasher edusan. Why? Because ashata de kamasid hai, on the year that this brother is testifying, lo kamasid hai. The other brother is not testifying. In other words, the edus will be fine because they're not testifying about the same matter. However, edus achas hazama, says Rashbam, she'im huzmu mishalslim b'neim v'gam eini zoman achi zomakul. You have to go ahead and if you want to call this group of Eidim Zomin, you'll have to find that all 3 brothers and the 3 strangers are Eidim Zomin. If you can't get all of them to be Eidim Zomin, the Eidos stands. And now once you accomplish that all 6 of these guys are Eidim Zomin, halacha is, then they will divide the cost of the Hazama price between all 6 of them. Gemara says, Masnis in our Mishnah, Delok Rabbi Kiva, does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Kiva. What's this referring to? So look at Rashbam. Rashbam tells us, the chashav legimel kitos shel edos achas l'shalosh shnei chazaka. Our Mishnah says you can take all 3 groups of edus and combine them together for this chazaka. That does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Kiva. The Tanya first says in the Brisa, Rabbi Yossi says, Kishahalach abo chalafta etzel Rebbe Yochanan ben Nuri limud Torah. When my father, whose name was Chalafta, went to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri to learn Torah, then how is he able to refer to his father by his first name Chalafta? So there's actually a whole discussion amongst the poskim. In Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah says, when it comes to a Rebbe, a person is allowed to refer to the Rebbe by the Rebbe's first name if they use the proper title. And the Gra says that the same thing is true with regard to a father. A person uses the proper title, like Rabbi Umori, he could refer to his father as well by the first name. However, there are those who like the Yamshel Shlomo disagrees and says when it comes to the father, you can never refer to him as by the first name. So if that's true, it could be that the Abu Chalafta in this case was not Rabbi Yossi's father, although generally Rabbi Yossi is the son of Chalafta. But either way, he says when Abu Chalafta went to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri to learn Torah, but Amri lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri it's Abu Chalafta. Some say it was the other way around. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri came to his father, limud Torah Amar lo. He said to him, Harei sha'achla shana rishona. First was in the field for year 1, b'fnei shnayim, in front of 2 Eidim. Shniya b'fnei shnayim. The second year in front of 2 other Eidim. Shlishis b'fnei shnayim. Year 3 in front of 2 other Eidim. Ma, what's the halacha? Amar lo. He said to him, Harei zu chazaka. It's a good chazaka. No problem. He was there for 3 years. 3 separate groups of Eidim are testifying for that. That's perfectly fine. Amar lo, he said to him, Afani Omer Kain, I say the same thing. So this is a conversation between Abba Chalaf and Yochanan ben Nuri. Ella Rabbi Kiva chalak b'davar. Rabbi Kiva disagrees on this matter and says, nope, you have to have one group of Eidim testifying on the entire 3-year block. If you don't have one group of Eidim testifying on the entire 3-year block, then it's not good. Why? Why does Rabbi Kiva say this? Shahaya. Kiva Omer, Kiva used to say, Davar, says Al Pishnayim, Al Pishlosha Eidim, Yakam Davar. They could establish a matter. However, davar, it comes to exclude the lo chatzi davar. It can't establish a half of a matter. And since a chazaka on 1 year is only a half of a matter, therefore, that's not sufficient. They have to testify the entire block. Rabbanan, now the Gemara says, hold on, it seems like this is a Xeris HaKasav. How could the Chachamim argue on this and say you can have two Eidim establishing a chazaka on 1 year? A chazaka on 1 year should be a chatzi davar. Gemara says, "Hay davar, v'lo chatzi davar me'avdile." What do they do with that? Gemara says, "Ilei milim ute echad omer achas begaba, ve'echad omer achas bekreisa." This is referring to a case where there is a dispute. I shouldn't say dispute. There's uncertainty about a girl as to whether or not she is a gedola. And the truth is, it's not specifically a girl. Just referencing this case, but there is a discussion whether or not this girl is a gedola, whether or not she's chayav in mitzvah. So you have two eidim come by and testify that they testified that she had simanim, she had grown the hair, which is a sign of her being a gedola. So if one aid comes and says, "Oh yes, I saw a hair on her back." One says you saw it on her stomach, which is a clean way of saying "Elsa Mako." You saw it in her private area. So the halacha is Hay chatzi davar v'chatz edasi. The problem in that case is that it's not only a chatzi davar. In other words, you have to see two sairas. In order for us to validate that someone is a gadol or gedola, they have to grow two hairs. Now, the two aidim would have to testify that they saw both of those hairs. Now, if one aid says I saw one, and another one says I saw another one, two different areas of the body, so then you have two problems. Number one, only one aid only saw one, so that aidus is not good. Another thing is it's only one aid who saw one, so it's half of an aidus on half of a matter. So it's a double negative. You have two witnesses who can testify that she reached the age of puberty, of being a gedola, because two say they saw one hair on her back, two say they saw one hair on the front of her body. So in such a case, that would be the case where that would be the case where it would not work. So what's the difference? In other words, let's just analyze this for a second. What's the difference between two Eidim saying we saw one hair, two Eidim saying we saw another hair, and two Eidim saying we saw 1 year, and two Eidim saying we saw another year? Where the Chachamim say when it comes to years, it's fine. When it comes to the hair on her body, it's not fine. What's the difference? The Rashbam explains as follows. What are we worried about with regard to the hair? We have to be able to validate the hair is actually a sign of her reaching the age of being a gedola. If the hair might just be a shuma, a wart, or some type of skin lesion that comes along with hair, now it would fall off. So you have to be able to see both at the same time to be able to validate that, no, this is not just a wart, this is not some type of skin lesion, this is actually signs of her being a gedola. However, when it comes to the years of chazaka, by definition, you can't see both at the same time. Because year one, by definition, is not year two. So therefore, the Chachamim say, it's perfectly fine to have two Eidim on year one and two Eidim on year two, because it's impossible to have year one and year two seen at the same time. That's just not the way years work. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu is beyond time. We're confined to time. So what you see during year one is not going to be there in year two. So therefore, Chacham says there's no problem of having separate edus. However, when it comes to testifying about someone being a gedola, you have to be able to validate that both hairs were present at the same time. Okay. Amr Yehuda, Echad Omar Achal Chitim. One person comes by and says comes by and says either he or she, regardless, that the one who's making the chazaka was there for 3 years and ate chitim, wheat. Ve'echad Omer, another one comes and says, achlas sa'orim, the person ate barley. Harezu chazaka, that is a perfect chazaka. Now, just for some background about this, before we get to this question, Rashbam actually says, the interesting thing, he says he went around and he asked all the people who work, all the agriculture people, how it works, and they all explained to him. He says, V'sha'alti, this is the last line before it gets really, really wide. La'ovdi adama v'amrli shal'olam kach hu aminug. He explains, year 1 they plant wheat, year 2 barley, year 3 wheat, year 4 barley. They always switch off, and that helps for the quality of the soil. They never have to take a break because they keep switching in the middle. So now the assumption is that a year that a person eats chitim, wheat, is not a year that they eat barley, because they don't grow it during the same year. So now if you have 2 Eidim saying he ate wheat, and 2 Eidim saying he ate barley, that should by definition mean it was 2 separate years. So the Gemara says, hold on, how could it be that if 2 Eidim say, if one Eid says he ate wheat, and another Eid says he ate barley, that will accept both of those Eidos, it can't be talking about the same year. That's why the Gemara asks the following question. If that's true, one person says, I saw this guy in the field during years 1, 3, and 5. Another person says he was here 2, 4, and 6. Are you going to tell me that's a chazak? And of course not, because you don't have 2 eidim on the years. You have 1 aid on 1, 3, 5, 1 aid on 2, 4, 6. You don't have 2 eidim testifying that the person was there for any three years. So again, how could it be that if you have 1 aid saying wheat, 1 aid saying barley, you're going to combine them? By definition, those won't be during the same years. The Gemara says, no, you misunderstood the whole thing. Amalei Rav Yehuda, who responds that Hachi Hashta. What's going on here? Hasam b'shat de kamased mar lo kamased mar. The aid who's saying year 2 is not testifying on year 1, and the aid who's testifying on year 3 is not testifying on year 4. So therefore, you can't combine them together. However, Hacha tarvayu b'chad b'shat kamased. In our case, what he meant was they were both testifying about the same year. However, they added in extra details which were not necessary. You don't have to say what he was eating. They added in, oh yes, he was there during the year of Tafshin Pei, and he was eating barley. The other guy said, yes, he was there during the year of Tafshin Pei, and he was eating wheat. Now the problem over there is they did contradict each other. However, Tarvau b'chad shata kamasid, my ikul meimar bechitil sa'ari, lava daitayud inchi. Not everybody is an agricultural expert, and not everybody knows the difference between a stalk of wheat and a stalk of barley. You know, when you go to the store and buy wheat, maybe you could tell the difference between a wheat kernel and a barley kernel. However, not everybody knows when you see a farmer working in the field, driving this massive tractor, loaded up on the back with all types of stalks, that this is wheat or this is barley. The guy thought it was barley, he thought it was wheat, but again, it's not an essential detail in terms of the chazaka, it just happens to be a fact that he added in. We have 2 minutes. Let's try to get to the Mishnah. Shlosha achim, 3 brothers. V'echad mitzarfim alayim. One person is combined with them to create edus. Harei elu shlosha eduyos ve'in edus achas lazama. It's 3 different edus, and in other words, and it's acceptable even though there's 3 brothers. However, it's one edus with regard to hazama. You have to go ahead and be mazim them all together. Hahu star, there was a star, top of Nadaina with Aleph. Davichasimi aleh beitrei. 2 people signed it in. Shachim chad minayu. One of them died. Asa achua dehai dekai, the brother of the one who was still alive. V'chad achrin lasudi achasimis yodea deida. So again, there was a star, a document that had 2 Eidim signed on it. Now one of the Eidim died. Now the live aid came. He verified this is my signature. Now we want to verify the signature of the dead aid. So now the brother of the live aid comes to say, yes, this indeed is the signature of that aid. And he came along with another person. Savar Avinu Lameimar, Haynamas Nisim, it's our Mishnah. Just like in our Mishnah, you could combine a brother with another person for the other eidos, because it's not really relevant. So you could also include a brother in this case. However, Rashi said, no, in our case, you're not taking away, nechi revia means minus a quarter, which means 3/4. You're not taking 3/4 away by the mouth of the brothers. In this case, it comes out 3/4 of the edus depends on two brothers. Why? Because the first aid takes 50% of the edus by saying, it was my signature. The second signature is only valid because of the brother and one other guy who validated that signature. Turns out that brother A takes responsibility for 50%, brother B takes responsibility for 25%, so the sum total of 75% of this edus comes from brothers, therefore it's not good. In our Mishnah, it's not 75% because each one of those edus had another person with it, so it's only 50%, and that's the difference between our Mishnah and that other case. We'll stop here. Have a wonderful day.